Okay. We're gonna get started.
Right at your feet.
And since our pastor's not here, he left this for us to watch. If you don't know who Ken Ham is, he is the founder of the Creation Museum in Kentucky. He helped out with like the building of the ark and so forth. And he also is, it's called the Genesis Answers. He's all about creation and so forth like that. Of course, you know the first name, which is Bill Nye. Bill Nye, the science guy. So everybody heard about him. He brought science to life for a lot of kids. But like I was talking to my daughter last night, you know, the devil likes to start our kids young. And by him teaching science, you know, he taught our kids that creation was billions and that we all come from monkeys and so forth like that, and that creation actually started billions and billions of years ago. So while he brought, on one hand, science to life for a lot of kids, he was also teaching them the incorrect way. And that's where Ken Ham steps in. And this is the first part of their debate that they do. We have not seen these, so I'm not 100% sure, you know, what they look like and so forth. So make sure you have a piece of paper and take down lots of notes because he is very knowledgeable. So with that being said, does anybody want to take us into prayer?
Okay.
Go ahead.
Heavenly Father, we want to thank you this afternoon, Father, for allowing us to assemble ourselves together to understand your ways, Lord. We thank you right now for everything that you have done for us. You prepared everything for us, and we must try and to go by it, Lord. We thank you right now for the pastor for his missing here, Father. May he get all his arrangement and come back study with us, Lord, because he is the one that you put set here. So we thank you for the sisters and brothers that came and those that on their way or not able to come. We praise that everything that you have done and said dwell in our heart through Christ our Lord and Savior. Amen.
Amen. And I think I forgot to turn on the sound bar. Bring your mic, your phone. Here I go. You've never heard of Bill Nye or?
We had a coin toss earlier to determine who would go first of these two men. The only thing missing was Joe Namath in a fur coat. But it went very well. Mr. Ham won the coin toss, and he opted to speak first. But first, let me tell you a little bit about both of these gentlemen. Mr. Nye's website describes him as a scientist, engineer, comedian, author, and inventor. Mr. Nye, as you may know, produced a number of award-winning TV shows, including the program he became so well known for, Bill Nye the Science Guy. While working on the Science Guy show, Mr. Nye won 7 National Emmy Awards for writing, performing, and producing the show, won 18 Emmys in 5 years. In between creating the shows, he wrote 5 kids' books about science, including his latest title, Bill Nye's Great Big Book of Tiny Germs. Bill Nye is the host of 3 television series. His program, The 100 Greatest Discoveries, airs on the Science Channel. The Eyes of Nye airs on PBS stations across the country. He frequently appears on interview programs to discuss a variety of science topics. Mr. Nye serves as executive director of the Planetary Society, the world's largest space interest group. He is a graduate of Cornell with a Bachelor's of Science degree in Mechanical Engineering. Mr. Ken Ham is the president and co-founder of Answers in Genesis, a Bible-defending organization that upholds the authority of the scriptures from the very first verse. Mr. Ham is the man behind the popular high-tech Creation Museum where we're holding this debate. The museum has had 2 million visitors in 6 years and has attracted much of the world's media. The Answers in Genesis website is well trafficked with 2 million visitors alone last month. Mr. Ham is also a best-selling author, a much-in-demand speaker, and the host of a daily radio feature carried on 700-plus stations. This is his second public debate on evolution and creation. The first was at Harvard in the 1990s. Mr. Ham is a native of Australia. He earned a bachelor's degree in applied science with an emphasis in environmental biology from the Queensland Institute of Technology, as well as a diploma of education at the University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia. And now, Mr. Ham, you opted to go first, so you will be first with your 5-minute opening statement.
Well, good evening. I know that not everyone watching this debate will necessarily agree with what I have to say, but I'm an Aussie and live over here in America, and they tell me I have an accent, and so it doesn't matter what I say. Some people tell me, we just like to hear saying it. So I hope you enjoy me saying it anyway. Well, the debate topic is this: is creation a viable model of origins in today's modern scientific era? You know, when this was first announced on the internet, there are lots of statements like this one from the Richard Dawkins Foundation: scientists should not debate creationists, period. And this one from one of the Discovery.com websites: should scientists debate creationists? You know, right here I believe there's a gross misrepresentation in our culture. We've seen people in being indoctrinated to believe that creationists can't be scientists. I believe it's all a part of secularists hijacking the word science. I want you to meet a modern day scientist who is a biblical creationist.
My name is Stuart Burgess. I'm a professor of engineering design at Bristol University in the UK. I have published over 130 scientific papers on the science of design in engineering and biological systems. From my research work, I have found that the scientific evidence fully supports creationism as the best explanation to origins. I've also designed major parts of spacecraft launched by ESA and NASA.
So here's a biblical creationist who's a scientist who's also an inventor. And I want young people to understand that. You know, the problem I believe is this: we need to define terms correctly. We need to define creation, evolution in regard to origins, and we need to define science. And in this opening statement, I want to concentrate on dealing with the word science. I believe the word science has been hijacked by secularists. Now, what is science? Well, the origin of the word comes from the classical Latin scientia, which means to know. And if you look up a dictionary, it'll say science means state of knowing, knowledge. But there's different types of knowledge, and I believe this is where the confusion lies. There's experimental observational science, as we call it. That's using the scientific method: observation, measurement, experiment, testing. That's what produces our technology: computers, spacecraft, jet planes, smoke detectors, looking at DNA, antibiotics, medicines and vaccines. You see, all scientists, whether creationists or evolutionists, actually have the same observational or experimental science. And it doesn't matter whether you're a creationist or an evolutionist, you can be a great scientist. For instance, here's an atheist who is a great scientist, Craig Venter, one of the first researchers to sequence the human genome. Or Dr. Raymond Damadian. He is a man who invented the MRI scanner and revolutionized medicine. He's a biblical creationist. But I want us to also understand molecules to man evolution belief has nothing to do with developing technology. You see, when we're talking about origins, we're talking about the past. We're talking about our origins. We weren't there. You can't observe that, whether it's molecules to man evolution or whether it's a creation account. And when you're talking about the past, we like to call that origins or historical science, knowledge concerning the past. Here at the Creation Museum, we make no apology about the fact that our origins or historical science actually is based upon the biblical account of origins. Now, when you research science textbooks being used in public schools, what we found is this. By and large, the origins of historical science is based upon man's ideas about the past, for instance, the ideas of Darwin. And our research has found that public school textbooks are using the same word science for observational science and historical science. They arbitrarily define science as naturalism and outrule the supernatural. They present molecules to man evolution as fact. They are imposing, I believe, the religion of naturalism or atheism on generations of students. You see, I assert that the word science has been hijacked by secularists in teaching evolution to force the religion of naturalism on generations of kids. Secular evolutionists teach that all life developed by natural processes from some primordial form, that man is just an evolved animal, which has great bearing on how we view life and death. For instance, as Bill states,
it's very hard to accept for many of us that when you die, it's over.
But you see, the Bible gives a totally different account of origins, of who we are, where we came from, the meaning of life, and our future. That through one man, sin entered the world, and death through sin, but that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. Whoever believes in him should not perish and have everlasting life. So, is creation a viable model of origins in today's modern scientific era? I say the creation-evolution debate is a conflict between two philosophical worldviews based on two different accounts of origins or science beliefs, and creation is the only viable model of historical science confirmed by observational science in today's modern scientific era.
And that is time. I had the unenviable job of being the timekeeper here. So I'm like the referee in football that you don't like, but I will periodically, if either one of our debaters runs over on anything, I will stop them in the name of keeping it fair for all. Mr. Ham, thank you for your comments. Now it's Mr. Nye's turn for a 5-minute opening statement. Mr. Nye.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I very much appreciate you including me in your facility here. Now, looking around the room, I think I see just one bow tie. Is that right? Just one. I'm telling you, why don't you try? Oh, yes, two. That's great. I started wearing bow ties when I was young in high school. My father showed me how to, his father showed him. And there's a story associated with this, which I find remarkable. My grandfather was in the Rotary, and he attended a convention in Philadelphia. And even in those days, at the turn of the last century, people rented tuxedos. And the tuxedo came with a bow tie, untied bow tie. So he didn't know how to tie it, so wasn't sure what to do. He just took a chance. He went to the hotel room next door, knocked on the door, excuse me, can you help me tie my tie? And the guy said, sure, lie down on the bed. So my grandfather, he wanted to have the tie on, wasn't sure what he was getting into, so he is said to have lain on the bed, and the guy tied a perfect bow tie knot, and quite reasonably, my grandfather said, thank you, why'd I have to lie down on the bed? The guy said, I'm an undertaker. It's really the only way I know how to do it. Now, that story was presented to me as a true story. It may or may not be, but it gives you something to think about, and it's certainly something to remember. So here tonight, we're going to have two stories, and we can compare Mr. Ham's story to the story from what I will call the outside, from mainstream science. The question tonight is, does Ken Ham's creation model hold up? Is it viable? So let me ask you all, what would you be doing if you weren't here tonight? That's right, you'd be home watching CSI. CSI Petersburg. Is it coming? I think it's coming. And on CSI, there is no distinction made between historical science and observational science. These are constructs unique to Mr. Ham. We don't normally have these anywhere in the world except here. Natural laws that applied in the past apply now. That's why they're natural laws. That's why we embrace them. That's how we made all these discoveries that enabled all this remarkable technology. So CSI is a fictional show, but it's based absolutely on real people doing real work. When you go to a crime scene and find evidence, you have clues about the past. And you trust those clues, and you embrace them, and you move forward to convict somebody. Mr. Ham and his followers have this remarkable view of a worldwide flood that somehow influenced everything that we observed in nature. A 500-foot wooden boat, 8 zookeepers for 14,000 individual animals, every land plant in the world underwater for a full year. I ask us all, is that really reasonable? You'll hear a lot about the Grand Canyon, I imagine, also, which is a remarkable place, and it has fossils. And the fossils in the Grand Canyon are found in layers. There is not a single place in the Grand Canyon where the fossils of one type of animal cross over into the fossils of another. In other words, when there was a big flood on the earth, you would expect drowning animals to swim up to a higher level. Not any one of them did. Not a single one. If you could find evidence of that, my friends, you could change the world. Now, I just want to remind us all, there are billions of people in the world who are deeply religious, who get enriched, who have a wonderful sense of community from their religion. They worship together, they eat together, they live in their communities and enjoy each other company. Billions of people. But these same people do not embrace the extraordinary view that the earth is somehow only 6,000 years old. That is unique. And here's my concern. What keeps the United States ahead, what makes the United States a world leader, is our technology, our new ideas, our innovations. If we continue to eschew science, eschew the process, and try to divide science into observational science and historic science, we are not going to move forward. We will not embrace natural laws. We will not make discoveries. We will not invent and innovate and stay ahead. So if you ask me if Ken Ham's creation model is viable, I say no. It is absolutely not viable. So stay with us over the next period, and you can compare my evidence to his. Thank you all very much.
Very nice start by both of our debaters here. And now each one will offer a 30-minute illustrated presentation to fully offer their case for us to consider. Mr. Ham, you're up.
Science confirmed by observational science in today's modern scientific era. And I said, what we need to be doing is actually defining our terms, and particularly 3 terms: science, creation, and evolution. Now, I discussed the meaning of the word science and what is meant by experimental or observational science briefly, and that both creationists and evolutionists can be great scientists, for instance. I mentioned Craig Venter, a biologist. He's an atheist, and he's a great scientist. He was one of the first researchers to sequence the human genome. I also mentioned Dr. Raymond Damadian, who actually invented the MRI scanner. I want you to meet a biblical creationist who is a scientist and inventor.
Hi, my name is Dr. Raymond Damadian. I am a young earth creation scientist and believe that God created the world in 6 24-hour days, just as recorded in the book of Genesis. By God's grace and the devoted prayers of my godly mother-in-law, I invented the MRI scanner in 1969. The idea that scientists who believe the earth is 6,000 years old cannot do real science is simply wrong.
Well, he's most adamant about that. And actually, he revolutionized medicine. And he's a biblical creationist. And I encourage children to follow people like that and make them their heroes. Let me introduce you to another biblical creation scientist.
My name is Danny Faulkner. I received my PhD in astronomy from Indiana University. For 26 and a half years, I was professor at the University of South Carolina, Lancaster, where I hold the rank of Distinguished Professor Emeritus. Upon my retirement from the university in January of 2013, I joined the research staff at Answers in Genesis. I'm a stellar astronomer. That means my primary interest is stars, but I'm particularly interested in the study of eclipsing binary stars. And I've published many articles in the astronomy literature, places such as the Astrophysical Journal, the Astronomical Journal, and the Observatory. There is nothing in observational astronomy that contradicts a recent creation.
I also mentioned Dr. Stuart Burgess, Professor of Design, Engineering Design at Bristol University in England. Now, he designed a double-action worm gear set for the 3 hinges of the robotic arm on a very expensive satellite. And if that had not worked, if that gear set had not worked, the whole satellite would have been useless. Yet Dr. Burgess is a biblical creationist who believes just as I believe. Now, think about this for a moment. A scientist like Dr. Burgess, who believe in creation just as I do, a small minority in the scientific world, but let's see what he says about scientists believing in creation.
I find that many of my colleagues in academia are sympathetic to the creationist viewpoint, including biologists. However, they are often afraid to speak out because of the criticisms they would get from the media and atheist lobby.
I agree, that's a real problem today. We need to have freedom to be able to speak on these topics. You know, I just want to say, by the way, that non-Christian scientists, we should say, non-Christian scientists are really borrowing from the Christian worldview anyway to carry out their experimental observational science. Think about it. When they're doing observational science using the scientific method, they have to assume the laws of logic, they have to assume the laws of nature, they have to assume the uniformity of nature. I mean, think about it. If the universe came about by natural processes, where did the laws of logic come from? Did they just pop into existence? Are we in a stage now where we only have half logic? So you see, I have a question for Bill Nye. How do you account for the laws of logic and the laws of nature from a naturalistic worldview that excludes the existence of God? Now, in my opening statement, I also discussed a different type of science or knowledge, origins or historical science. See, again, there's a confusion here, there's a misunderstanding here. People, by and large, have not been taught to look at what you believe about the past as different to what you're observing in the present. You don't observe the past directly. When you think about the creation account, I mean, we can't observe God creating, we can't observe the creation of Adam and Eve. We admit that. We're willing to admit our beliefs about the past. But see, what you see in the present is very different. Even some public school textbooks, actually, well, they sort of acknowledge the difference between historical and observational science. Here is an earth science textbook that's used in public schools, and we read this. In contrast to physical geology, the aim of historical geology is to understand Earth's long history. And then they make the statement, historical geology, so we're talking about historical science, tries to establish a timeline of the vast number of physical and biological changes that have occurred in the past. We study physical geology before historical geology because we first must understand how Earth works before we try to unravel its past. In other words, we observe things in the present and then, okay, we're assuming that that's always happened in the past and we're going to try and figure out how this happened. See, there is a difference between what you observe and what happened in the past. Let me illustrate it this way. If Bill Nye and I went to the Grand Canyon, we could agree that that's a Coconino sandstone in the Hermit Shale, and there's the boundary, they're sitting one on top of the other. We could agree on that. Do you know what we would disagree on? I mean, we could even analyse the minerals and agree on that. But we would disagree on how long it took to get there. But see, none of us saw the sandstone or the shale being laid down. There's a supposed 10 million year gap there, but I don't see a gap, but that might be different to what Bill Nye would see. But see, there's a difference between what you actually observe directly and then your interpretation in regard to the past. When I was at the Goddard Space Center a number of years ago, I met creationists and evolutionists who were both working on the Hubble telescope. They agreed on how to build the Hubble telescope. You know what they disagreed on? Well, they disagreed on how to interpret the data the telescope obtained in regard to the age of the universe. And, we could go on and talk about lots of other similar sorts of things. For instance, I've heard Bill Nye talk about how a smoke detector works using the radioactive element americium. And I totally agree with him on that. We agree how it works. We agree how radioactivity enables that to work. But if you're then going to use radioactive elements and talk about the age of the Earth, you've got a problem because you weren't there. We've got to understand parent elements, daughter elements, and so on. We could agree whether you're a creationist or evolutionist on the technology to put the rover on Mars, but we're going to disagree on how to interpret the origin of Mars. I mean, there are some people that believe there was even a global flood on Mars and there's no liquid water on Mars. But, you know, we're going to disagree maybe on our interpretation of origins, and you can't prove either way because, not from an observational science perspective, because we've only got the present. Creationists and evolutionists both work on medicines and vaccines. You see, it doesn't matter whether you're a creationist or an evolutionist, all scientists have the same experimental or observational science. So I have a question for Bill Nye. Can you name one piece of technology that could only have been developed starting with a belief in molecules to man evolution? Now, here's another important fact. Creationists and evolutionists all have the same evidence. Bill Nye and I have the same Grand Canyon. We don't disagree on that. We would have the same fish fossil, this is one from the Creation Museum, the same dinosaur skeletons, the same animals, the same humans, the same DNA, the same radioactive decay elements that we see. We have the same universe. Actually, we all have the same evidences. It's not the evidences that are different. It's a battle over the same evidence in regard to how we interpret the past. And you know why that is? Because it's really a battle over worldviews and starting points. It's a battle over philosophical worldviews and starting points, but the same evidence. Now, I admit my starting point is that God is the ultimate authority. But if someone doesn't accept that, then man has to be the ultimate authority. And that's really the difference when it comes down to it. You see, I've been emphasizing the difference between historical origin science, knowledge about the past when you weren't there, and we need to understand that we weren't there. Or experimental or observational science, using your five senses in the present, the scientific method, what you can directly observe, test, repeat. There's a big difference between those two. And that's not what's being taught in our public schools, and that's why kids aren't being taught to think critically and correctly about the origins issue. But you know, it's also important to understand, when talking about creation and evolution, both involve historical science and observational science. You see, the role of observational science is this: it can be used to confirm or otherwise one's historical science based on one's starting point. Now, when you think about the debate topic and what I affirmed concerning creation, if our origins or historical science based on the Bible's account of origins is true, then there should be predictions from this that we can test using observational science, and there are. For instance, based on the Bible, we'd expect to find evidence confirming an intelligence produced life. We'd expect to find evidence confirming after their kind. The Bible says God made kinds of animals and plants after their kind, implying each kind produces its own, not that one kind changes into another. You'd expect to find evidence confirming a global flood of Noah's day, evidence confirming one race of humans, because we all go back to Adam and Eve. Biologically, that would mean there's one race. Evidence confirming the Tower of Babel, that God gave different languages. Evidence confirming a young universe. Now, I can't go through all of those, but a couple of them we'll look at briefly. After their kind, evidence confirming that. In the Creation Museum, we have a display featuring replicas, actually, of Darwin's finches. They're called Darwin's finches. Darwin collected finches from the Galapagos and took them back to England, and we see the different species, the different beak sizes here. And you know, from the specimens that Darwin obtained in the Galapagos, he actually pondered these things and how do you explain this? And in his notes, actually, he came up with this diagram here, a tree. And he actually said, I think. So he was talking about different species, and maybe those species came from some common ancestor. Actually, when it comes to finches, we actually would agree as creationists that different finch species came from a common ancestor, but a finch is what they would have to come from. You see, Darwin wasn't just thinking about species. Darwin had a much bigger picture in mind. When you look at The Origin of Species and read that book, you'll find he made this statement: from such low and intermediate form, both animals and plants may have been developed, and if we admit this, we must likewise admit that all organic beings which have ever lived on this earth may be descended from some one primordial form. So he had in mind what we today know as an evolutionary tree of life, that all life has arisen from some primordial form. Now, when you consider the classification system, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, we would say, as creationists, and we have many creation scientists who have researched this, and for lots of reasons, I would say the kind in Genesis 1 really is more at the family level of classification. For instance, there's one dog kind, there's one cat kind, even though we have different genera, different species. That would mean, by the way, you didn't need anywhere near the number of animals on the ark as people think. You wouldn't need all the species of dogs, just 2. Not all the species of cats, just 2. And you see, based on the biblical account there in Genesis 1, creationists have drawn up what they believe is a creation orchard. In other words, they're saying, look, there's great variation in the genetics of dogs and finches and so on. And so over time, particularly after Noah's flood, you'd expect if there were 2 dogs, for instance, you could end up with different species of dogs because there's an incredible amount of variability in the genes of any creature. And so you'd expect these different species up here, but there's limits. Dogs will always be dogs, finches will always be finches. Now, as a creationist, I maintain that observational science actually confirms this model based on the Bible. For instance, take dogs. Okay, in a scientific paper dated January 2014, that's this year, scientists working at the University of California stated this: "We provide several lines of evidence supporting a single origin for dogs and disfavoring alternative models in which dog lineages arise separately from geographically distinct wolf populations." And they put this diagram in the paper. By the way, that diagram is very, very similar to this diagram that creationists proposed based upon the creation account in Genesis. In other words, you have a common dog ancestor that gives rise to the different species of dogs, and that's exactly what we're saying here. Now, in the Creation Museum, we actually show the finches here, and you see the finches with their different beaks beside dog skulls, different species of dogs. By the way, there's more variation in the dog skulls here than there are in these finches. Yet the dogs, well, that's never used as an example of evolution, but the finches are. Particularly in the public school textbooks, students are taught, see the changes that are occurring here? And here's another problem that we've got. Not only has the word science been hijacked by secularists, I believe the word evolution has been hijacked by secularists. The word evolution has been hijacked using what I call a bait and switch. Let me explain to you. The word evolution is being used in public school textbooks, and we often see it in documentaries and so on. It's used for observable changes that we would agree with, and then used for unobservable changes, such as molecules to man. Let me explain to you what's really going on, because I was a science teacher in the public schools, and I know what the students were taught, and I check the public school textbooks anyway to know what they're taught. See, students are taught today, look, there's all these different animals, plants, but they're all part of this great big tree of life that goes back to some primordial form. And look, we see changes in finches, changes in dogs, and so on. Now, we don't deny the changes. You see that. You see different species of finches, different species of dogs. But then they put it all together in this evolutionary tree. But that's what you don't observe. You don't observe that. That's belief there. That's their historical science. I would say it's wrong. But you know what you do observe? You do observe different species of dogs, different species of finches, but then there are limits. And you don't see one kind changing into another. Actually, we're told that if you teach creation in the public schools, that's teaching religion. If you teach evolution, that's science. And I'm going to say, wait a minute. Actually, the creation model here, based upon the Bible, observational science confirms this. This is what you observe. You don't observe this tree. Actually, it's the public school textbooks that are teaching a belief, imposing it on students, and they need to be teaching them observational science to understand the reality of what's happening. Now, what we found is that public school textbooks present the evolutionary tree as science, but reject the creation orchard as religion. But observational science confirms the creation orchard. So public school textbooks are rejecting observational science and imposing a naturalistic religion on students. The word evolution has been hijacked using a bait and switch to indoctrinate students to accept evolutionary belief as observational science. Let me introduce you to another scientist, Richard Lenski, Michigan State University. He's a great scientist. He's known for culturing E. coli in the lab. And he found there were some E. coli that actually seemed to develop the ability to grow on substrate, on citrate in substrate. But Richard Lenski is here mentioned in this book, and it's called Evolution in the Lab. So the ability to grow on citrate is said to be evolution. And there are those that say, hey, this is against the creationists. For instance, Jerry Coyne from the University of Chicago says, Lenski's experiment is also yet another poke in the eye for anti-evolutionists. He says the thing I like most is that it says you can get these complex traits evolving by a combination of unlikely events. But is it a poke in the eye for anti-evolutionists? Is it really seeing complex traits evolving? What does it mean that some of these bacteria are able to grow on citrate? Let me introduce you to another biblical creationist who is a scientist.
Hi, my name is Dr. Andrew Favich. I got my PhD from the University of Oklahoma in microbiology. I teach at Liberty University and I do research on E. coli in the intestine. I've published in secular journals from the American Society for Microbiology, including Infection Immunity and Applied Environmental Microbiology, as well as several others. My work has been cited even the past year in the journals Nature, Science Translational Medicine, Public Library of Science, Public Library of Science Genetics. It's cited regularly in those journals. And while I was taught nothing but evolution, I don't accept that position. I do my research from a creation perspective. When I look at the evidence that people cite of E. coli supposedly evolving over 30 years, over 30,000 generations in the lab, and people say that it is now able to grow on citrate, I don't deny that it grows on citrate, but it's not any kind of new information. It's the information's already there. It's just a switch that gets turned on and off, and that's what they reported in there. There's nothing new.
See, students need to be told what's really going on here. Certainly there's change, but it's not change necessary for molecules to man. Now, we could look at other predictions. What about evidence confirming one race? Well, when we look at the human population, we see lots of differences. But based on Darwin's idea 2000, this was headline news, and what we read was this: they had put together a draft of the entire sequence of the human genome and unanimously declared there is only one race, the human race. Wow, who would have guessed? But you see, there we have observational science confirming the creation account, not confirming at all Darwin's ideas. Now, there's much more that could be said on each of these topics. Obviously, you can't do that in a short time like this, and you can do a lot more research. I suggest you visit our website at Answers in Genesis for a lot more information. So, the debate topic is creation a viable model of origins in today's scientific era. I said we need to define the terms, and particularly the term science and the term evolution, and I believe we need to understand how they're being used to impose an anti-God religion on generations of unsuspecting students. You see, I keep emphasizing we do need to understand the difference between experimental or observational science and historical science. And you know what? The secularists don't like me doing this because they don't want to admit that there's a belief aspect to what they're saying, and there is, and they can't get away from it. Let me illustrate this with a statement from Bill Nye.
That you can show the Earth is not flat. You can show the Earth is not 10,000 years old.
By the way, I agree. You can show the Earth is not flat. There's a video from the Galileo spacecraft showing the Earth, and speeded up, of course, but spinning. You can see it's a sphere. You can observe that. You can't observe the age of the Earth. You don't see that. You see, again, I emphasize there's a big difference between historical science, talking about the past, and observational science, talking about the present. And I believe what's happening is this, that students are being indoctrinated by the confusion of terms. The hijacking of the word science and the hijacking of the word evolution in a bait and switch. Let me illustrate further with this video clip, because here I assert that Bill Nye is equating observational science with historical science, and I also say it's not a mystery when you understand the difference.
Apparently, people with these deeply held religious beliefs, they embrace that whole literal interpretation of the Bible as written in English as a worldview. And at the same time, they accept aspirin, antibiotic drugs, airplanes, but they're able to hold these two worldviews. And this is a mystery.
Actually, I suggest to you it's not a mystery. You see, when I'm talking about antibiotics, aspirin, smoke detectors, jet planes, that's Ken Ham, the observational science bloke. I'm an Australian. We call guys blokes, okay? But when you're talking about creation and thousands of years of the age of the Earth, that's Ken Ham, the historical science bloke. I'm willing to admit that. Now, when Bill Nye's talking about aspirin, antibiotics, jet planes, smoke detectors, he does a great job at that. I used to enjoy watching him on TV too. That's Bill Nye, the observational science guy. But when he's talking about evolution of millions of years, I'm challenging him that that's Bill Nye, the historical science guy. And I challenge the evolutionists to admit the belief aspects of their particular worldview. Now, at the Creation Museum, we're only too willing to admit our beliefs based upon the Bible, but but we also teach people the difference between beliefs and what one can actually observe and experiment with in the present. I believe we're teaching people to think critically and to think in the right terms about science. I believe it's the creationists that should be educating the kids out there, because we're teaching them the right way to think. You know, we admit our origins of historical science is based upon the Bible, but I'm just challenging evolutionists to admit the belief aspects of evolution and be upfront about the difference here. As I said, I'm only too willing to admit my historical science based on the Bible. And let me further go on and define the term creation as we use it. By creation, we mean, here at Answers in Genesis and the Creation Museum, we mean the account based on the Bible. Yes, I take Genesis as literal history, as Jesus did. And here at the Creation Museum, we walk people through that history. We walk them through creation, a perfect creation. God made Adam and Eve, land, animal, kind, sea creatures, and so on. And then sin and death entered the world, so there was no death before sin. That means, how can you have billions of dead things before man sinned? And then the catastrophe of Noah's flood. If there was a global flood, you'd expect to find billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. I had to say that because a lot of our supporters would want me to. And what do you find? Billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. Confusion, the Tower of Babel. God gave different languages, so you get different people groups. So this is the geological, astronomical, anthropological, biological history as recorded in the Bible. So this is concerning what happened in the past that explains the present. And then, of course, that God's Son stepped into history to be Jesus Christ, the God-man, to die on the cross, be raised from the dead, and one day there's going to be a new heavens and a new earth to come. And, you know, not only is this an understanding of history to explain the geology, biology, astronomy, and so on, to connect the present to the past, but it's also a foundation for our whole worldview. For instance, in Matthew 19, when Jesus was asked about marriage, he said, "Have you not read? He which made the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they'll be one flesh." He quoted from Genesis as literal history, Genesis 1 and 2. God invented marriage, by the way. That's where marriage comes from, and it's to be a man and a woman. And not only marriage, ultimately, every single biblical doctrine of theology, directly or indirectly, is founded in Genesis. Why is there sin in the world? Genesis. Why is there death? Genesis. Why do we wear clothes? Genesis. Why did Jesus die on the cross? Genesis. This is a very important book. It's foundational to all Christian doctrine. And you see, when we look at that, what I call the 7 C's of history that we walk people through here at the museum, think about how it all connects together. A perfect creation, it'll be perfect again in the future. Sin and death entered the world. That's why God's Son died on the cross, and to conquer death and offer a free gift of salvation. The flood of Noah's day, a reminder that the flood was a judgment because of man's wickedness, but at the same time a message of God's grace and salvation, as Noah and his family had to go through a door to be saved, so we need to go through a door to be saved. Jesus Christ said, "I am the door, by me if any man enter in, he'll be saved." And we make no apology about the fact that what we're on about is this. If you confess with your mouth the Lord Jesus and believe in your heart God has raised him from the dead, you'll be saved. Now, as soon as I say that, people say, see, if you allow creation in schools, for instance, if you allow students to even hear about it, this is religion. You know, let me illustrate this, talking about a recent battle in Texas over textbooks in the public school. The newspaper report said this: textbook and classroom curriculum battles have long ranged in Texas, pitting creationists, those who see God's hand in the creation of the universe, against academics. Stop right there. Notice, creationists, academics. Creationists can't be academics. Creationists can't be scientists. See, it's the way things are worded out there. It's an indoctrination that's going on. Who worry about religious and political ideology trumping scientific fact. Wait a minute, what do I mean by science? You're talking about what you observe, or you're talking about your beliefs about the past? Now, Kathy Miller is the president of the Texas Freedom Network, and she's vocally spoken out. She's spoken out about this textbook battle there in Texas. And the mission statement of the organization she's president of says, the Texas Freedom Network advances a mainstream agenda of religious freedom and individual liberties to counter the religious right. Religious freedom, individual liberties. And then she makes this statement: science education, what does she mean by science, should be based on mainstream science education, not on personal ideological beliefs of unqualified reviewers. Wait a minute, they want religious liberty and not personal ideological beliefs? I assert this. Public school textbooks are using the same word science for observational and historical science, They arbitrarily define science as naturalism and outlaw the supernatural. They present molecules to man evolution as fact, and they're imposing the religion of naturalism on generations of students. They're imposing their ideology on the students, that everything's explained by natural processes. That is a religion. What does she mean by religious liberty? They tolerate their religion. See, the battle is really about authority. It's more than just science or evolution or creation. It's about who is the authority in this world, man or God. If you start with naturalism, then what about morals? Who decides right and wrong? Well, it's subjective. Marriage, well, whatever you want it to be. Get rid of old people. I mean, why not? I mean, they're just animals. They're costing us a lot of money. Abortion, get rid of spare cats, get rid of spare kids. We're all animals. But if you start from God's word, there are moral absolutes. God decides right and wrong. Marriage, one man and one woman. Sanctity of life. We care for old people. They're made in the image of God. Life begins at fertilization, so abortion is killing a human being. We do see the collapse of Christian morality in our culture, an increase in moral relativism, because generations of kids are being taught the religion of naturalism and that the Bible can't be trusted. And so again I say, creation is the only viable model of historical science confirmed by observational science in today's modern scientific era. You know what, I'm a science teacher. I want to see kids taught science. I love science. I want to see more Dr. Damadians in the world. You know, if we teach them the whole universe is a result of natural processes and not designed by a creator God, they might be looking in the wrong places or have the wrong idea when they're looking at the creation in regard to how you develop technology. Because if they look at it as just random processes, that could totally influence the way they think. If they understand it was a perfect world marred by sin, that could have a great effect on how they then look for overcoming diseases and problems in the world. I want children to be taught the right foundation, that there's a God who created them, who loves them, who died on the cross for them, and that they're special. They're made in the image of God.
There you go. Thank you, Mr. Ham. We can applaud Mr. Ham. And you know, it did occur to me when you had my old friend Larry King up there, you could have just asked him. He's been around a long time. And he's a smart guy. He could probably answer for all of us.
Alright.
Now we're watching tonight or the second one?
Huh?
We're watching both tonight?
Nope, not tonight.
What?
And watch the other one next Wednesday.
I don't want to forget everything we did.
Alright, so we heard Ken Ham's side, so next week we're gonna see and hear Bill Nye's version of it.